Joe Volpe, publisher of the Corriere Canadese, North America's only Italian language daily newspaper, on behalf of Go Live TV and Corcan Media Group, here with our usual program on law and reality. And with me is Richard Borax, as we've identified him, noted immigration lawyer. And today we're going to pick up that theme that we discussed a little while ago, and that is deporting children. Deporting Canadian-born children and deporting children of people who might be here irregularly. Now, I wanted to discuss that with you, but then we were talking initially about the children of Bruno and Ariana.
That's right.
Then we focused on an even more particular case, and that is the Dimitri family.
Yep.
Dimitri family, they came here 5 years ago. They have 4 kids, 2 of them born here, and the government of Canada, CBSA, says, you're leaving, all of you.
And these weren't anchor babies, Joe.
No, they weren't anchor babies. Now, just for everybody else, what anchor babies means is that people come here as tourists in order to have children, so that the children acquire, by birthright, Canadian citizenship, and then can presumably use it later on in their life. You know, mother comes here and has a baby. I just think about that for a moment. They spend all kinds of money in order to come here and have a baby.
Well, it does happen.
It does happen, but as we pointed out in yesterday's article of the Corriere Canadese,
that was a good article, by the way. I enjoyed that.
You got to start reading it, yeah. But what it does is it really says, you know, this is a non-issue.
Yeah.
It's so small, it's a non-issue. But
it's being used as an issue of division.
And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. And just like other things that are being used as division. You know, in the last couple of days, the issue of a notwithstanding clause being used by the province of Ontario in order to ensure that its legislation be implemented immediately. Legislation particular to the composition of council in Toronto.
I characterize it differently. That was not a matter of creating division. I can understand the public
division
policy.
Now.
It is because it was taken as division. Let's put that aside for another day.
But let's talk about the fact that there is a notwithstanding clause.
Yep.
So just to clarify things, okay? So the Canadian Constitution gives apportions certain authorities.
Yep.
And you might say, how does this enter into the Dimitri family and into immigration? But the Supreme Court, now that you mentioned it, is the final arbiter in the way that the laws are interpreted. And then everybody abides by them. There's a directive. And the Supreme Court, in the issue that we're talking about, on December 10th, 2015, said that whenever you're having a consideration about citizenship and or immigration, you always have to take into consideration...
Let me throw a wrench in that argument. The Supreme Court is only the final arbiter on the issue of the Charter unless Parliament decides to override the Supreme Court. Parliament is the final arbiter. And the politicians have walked away from their responsibility.
Well, having been one of those politicians, we always operated under the basis, and we still do, I shouldn't say we anymore, what they do, what a political authority does is it says, here's the law we want to make. Now, if somebody wants to contest it, there's a procedure they go through. They go and contest it in the courts. The ultimate court is the Supreme Court, if it makes it that far. But the court's decision is the one that everybody abides by.
The provincial government should be commended for putting that argument to rest. But when the Constitution was repatriated by Trudeau Sr., there were people, including yours truly, who suggested, as much as we have to respect the Supreme Court, and I do, Parliament never abdicated. In the case of Queen's Park, they never abdicated. But Parliament, at the end of the day, can override Queen's Park.
Except that just a second. So Parliament can override any court decision, especially that by the Supreme Court, it's a very rare thing. It hasn't happened at the federal
Just
level.
because it's rare is a political decision.
Just a moment. So the government of Canada doesn't override it. In other words, it abides by the court decision.
That's a
what's
decision.
happened. So the court's decision is, in that instance, the final one,
Absolutely.
unless somebody overrides.
Absolutely.
So, and I want you to keep that in mind, because you have to straighten me out and everybody else that's watching us. So, unless the government overrides
That's
that
right.
decision, it is the de facto decision of the day. It governs procedure, governs process, and it governs policy.
Absolutely.
All right. So now the province of Ontario decided, because it has the authority to so decide, that it wanted to override a court decision.
Right.
So it has overridden that court decision, and it will be verified in the course of the next couple of days. So it hasn't done anything that is not within its authority to do.
That's right.
What a federal government, a federal parliament can do is it can set aside a provincial law.
That's right.
That's not happened.
That's right.
So there are two things. First of all, we can talk about the principle of setting aside, overriding Section 33 of the Charter, and just kind of skirting around the issue. And the Dimitri case is,
That wasn't skirting. That was a spit in the court's face.
well, the court said you've got to take into account the children's best interests.
And did they?
Well,
And Joe, there's always a people make mistake. Things happen. But when it happens more than 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the time with children who should be protected by the government pursuant to a charter argument, decision of the Supreme Court, when the tsunami of pain inflicted on these kids by the federal government ignoring the Supreme Court, that's not a one-off. That's a conscious spit in the court's face.
well, maybe you're being a little too strong on this. However, I read the decision by the arbiter on humanitarian and compassionate applications.
Sure.
Resident in Vancouver.
Yep.
The Dimitri family is somewhere in southern Ontario.
Sure.
Okay. The officer said, I've taken into consideration the obligations imposed upon us by the Supreme Court, but I still don't want them here.
You know, that is so improper. See, the Supreme Court, the courts rely on government to enforce their decisions. And the federal government, with the Dimitri kids, cannot have it both ways. Justin Trudeau said today, if we can show it on the screen, he said yesterday that, and it's worth reading, that this government will defend the charter rights of every Canadian.
But these kids aren't Canadian.
The Dimitri kids, too, are born in this country. They're Canadian citizens. They have passports. They're Canadian, period.
Well, listen, maybe I may be arguing against people that I used to work with, but there's a submission in the courts, in a High Court of Appeal the other day, argued by the government of Canada through the Minister of Refugees and Immigration and Citizenship, that says kids born here are not citizen if their parents aren't permanent resident or citizens. The Dimitri parents are neither.
You know, if that doesn't fly in the face of the December 2015 Supreme Court Charter decision, I don't know what is. For the federal government, for Justin Trudeau to send his lawyers into court and saying that Canadian citizen kids born here will not suffer hardship if they're deported from Canada, and that argument is based on the fact that the federal government does not have to defend their charter rights. I mean, that just boggles the mind.
Okay, so you're making my argument, because obviously that's not.
But Joe, for me, I'll tell you what the main issue for me is. You know, the last week has been just a tidal storm of news on this is the big issue.
Well, notwithstanding clause, whether you can apply it, whether you should apply it, what are the circumstances under which you do it?
The immigration side of it, the citizenship side of it.
Yeah.
It's just coming at us. And if you'll notice, where have our elected parliamentarians been on this matter? I repeat, Parliament is the final arbiter of rights, your rights and my rights and our kids' rights, and our grandkids' rights. Parliament is a final arbiter. Parliament is made up of parliamentarians, as you well know. These folks get elected. In the Dimitri case, a sensitive case in the Italian community.
In any community, if we're talking about kids and families.
Okay, but specifically, there are 11. There are 11 elected MPs. Maybe more. That's on the government side. Then you got some of the guys on the opposition side. Not a peep. And I think I saw one of these gentlemen on your program recently. These are educated people, elected people.
Well, the one that you're talking about is not only a member of Parliament, he's a parliamentary secretary, and he's a lawyer by profession. He's a colleague of yours.
And a very good prosecutor. So he knows. They understand these issues.
I don't want to make judgmental issues about the quality of any prosecutor or any solicitor.
These are highly qualified, educated people, and for them to allow not a peep. When the provincial government wanted to reduce the number of councillors from 47 to 25, an issue that means, in the big scheme of things, means nothing, practically speaking, historically, then these folks, these elected people in Ottawa, parliamentarians, who do have the power over rights, in the case of the Dimitri kids, life and death decisions, figuratively speaking.
No, it's actually not that figurative.
Very good.
We'll raise that issue once again later on.
And where are these elected people? You know, where is Greg Sobara? I'm sorry, I've got to mention names here. Sorry, Francesco Sobara, Marco Mendicino, Judy Scrow. Where are these people?
So we have invited on this program the Minister for Refugees, Immigration and Citizenship, and their office hasn't replied. It's been about 2 weeks, so I guess they need a little bit more time.
Yeah.
But so the minister is a former refugee himself.
Yep.
And one would have expected that he would have done more. So the lines of communication from our perspective are still available, are still open. But you know, I don't know why you decided to take on my side of the issue. My side of the issue is that the most important thing that a government can do is to protect the rights of anybody who's on Canadian soil.
The concern, I'm not just picking on those elected representatives because they happen to be Italian background. When you were there in cabinet,
I would like to think that the Italian members of Parliament would be just as aggressive in promoting the rights, the charter rights, human rights of any citizen whose background may be Italian, but that is, period, just a new Canadian.
Well, let me be, when Quebec's interests, we live in a country which is made up, it's a sum of its parts. And when New Brunswick has its problems, when Newfoundland's got its problems, Quebec has got their problems,
well, they
various
have
communities.
Advocates in Parliament. They have advocates.
They have advocates. Who's advocating for these kids? Have you heard of people?
Go Live TV and Corcan Media Group and Corriere Canadese. Isn't that good?
No,
yeah, I'm sorry to be facetious like that.
Okay.
But so we're doing the advocating.
It's not good enough. It's not good enough. In the case, you're being facetious, I know, but in a way, I'm not saying you're protecting them, defending them, but there are some serious issues here. Who's advocating for this? When that Justin Trudeau won this election largely because the little boy died on the beach in 2015.
You're talking about the little Syrian refugee.
Little Syrian boy, that tragedy. And Canadians showed that they're good, sensitive people, and they were just shocked and taken aback. And Trudeau and all these guys who got elected, they were, I hate to say, they were using that poor dead
Well, I
body
don't
on the
think that-
beach.
I don't think they were using that, but
Well,
obviously it was
where are
something
they
that
now? Where are they
it's
now
an issue that
advocating for the Dimitri family?
It's an issue that galvanized the Canadian public.
Well, why-
And they said, you know, the government of the day, forget about its brand, but the government of the day wasn't responding in the way that Canadians saw themselves to respond.
But
so
the Syrians had a voice. They had powerful voices. Who are the voices for the Dimitri kids?
who could be any kids, quite frankly.
Any kids? Well, let's get right to the point. Who is speaking for the Dimitri kids?
Well, yeah, I've already given you an indication of who I think would be speaking for it. But,
Yeah.
you know, we started off by discussing the issues about the weapons, the tools available to government. So we have on one side, I don't want to be put in a position where I'm defending
We have the
Rob
tools
Ford
and
as
we have the
premier.
tool maker. We have the guys who have to use the tools. And the parliamentarians, at the end of the day, are the cabinet makers, so to speak. They are the tradesmen, the craftspeople who have to call for those laws and those tools to be used. They're not put, and Hussein, the Minister of Immigration, he's the gentleman who has to enforce those rules. But he has to be pushed into it. We
So
live in a-
you asked a moment ago, like, where are the parliamentarians and what are they doing? So
Yeah.
I've seen, and I want to get your professional opinion rather than your own emotive and personal
Yeah.
one. But so you have members of parliament from the Toronto area taking every interview that they can get in order to say, you know, that the premier should not do this, but, you know, the government of Canada is not going to override
Yeah.
the premier's decision to set aside
Yeah.
the Superior Court's indication that the election should be held under 47, et cetera.
Sure.
Because it was an element of fairness, not anything else. At the same time, those same members of parliament from their government are not telling all of their officials in immigration on refugee issues, on humanitarian and compassionate considerations, that the element of fairness includes the fact that those kids born in this country deserve to be treated like every other child, according to this Supreme Court's decision.
Ahmed Hussein is overriding the Supreme Court of Canada. And not one of his caucus members...
I didn't hear the invocation of a notwithstanding clause.
Absolutely. In practice, they're overriding. Ahmed Hussein is overriding on the Supreme Court on the humanitarian capacity
As
issue.
I said, let me take you back to it. I read the decision.
Sure.
So I didn't read it with a lawyer's eyes. I didn't read it with a lawyer's training. I read it. I read it, and I read the arbiter, who is not a lawyer, say, I took into consideration the Supreme Court's decision. And in my view, it doesn't apply to these kids.
And this guy still got a job?
Well, as I read that, quite frankly, I was really surprised. I was shocked.
Yeah.
So you know that we've talked, or I've talked on behalf of my paper, and sometimes we've discussed as well, the whole issue of use solely. You know,
Here's a question. So that officer in British Columbia who made that statement, didn't he override the Supreme Court?
Well, you know, look, I'm not approaching this from a lawyer's
Okay,
training.
okay.
So I said, I don't understand this. That's why I'm asking you. I can tell you that in Europe, the whole issue of immigrants, refugees, coming into foreign soil and may subsequently have kids, it's gripping the entire continent. Every country is responding to it. Every country has an opinion on what happens in the adjacent country because they all have a stake
And
in
here?
it. And it's the most important issue of the day. It's not the economy, it's not the spread, it's not anything. It's about how you treat people, period. They don't have a notwithstanding clause, so they have to discuss things openly.
Are you suggesting the Canadian people or their elected officials are either cold, callous, or stupid?
Well, you know, I don't have a legal training. I don't like to have people put words in my mouth
Sorry,
unless
sir.
I want to use those words. So thank you for suggesting some that I'm going to put over to one side.
Yeah.
What the words that I want to use are, it seems to me that the Supreme Court or any superior court that says this is how the law should be addressed.
Yep.
And you or us as representatives of the people, we have the authority to, unless we turn around and say, notwithstanding what you, the court, have said, we're going to do this. because we're going to answer to the people.
Which is fine.
I didn't hear that
You did.
in the case of the Dimitri kids.
What you've heard is the sound of rats scrambling.
Oh, well, I mean, here we are. We're casting aspersions on people who aren't here to defend themselves.
Well, bring them over here.
Well, look, we just may do that because through all this discussion, I don't want to appear to be seen as a defender of Premier Ford's decision to invoke a notwithstanding
But he
clause.
showed a principled legal position. You can agree or disagree, but he didn't insult the Constitution.
He just simply said, I don't believe the court. The court has the right to overturn what I've said or what we have
But
said.
he did that within the rules.
No, he did it openly.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the issue for us is whether there has been a deliberate decision to override the Supreme Court's directive to treat kids as human
That's
beings,
the
to
issue.
protect their human rights,
That's
and
the
to
issue.
protect the rights that they would have acquired by virtue of having been born to parents who have been here for at least 5 years, whether they have a permanent residency or a citizenship. And by the way, whoever's watching this will probably say, well, how do you know they're not doing anything? Well, because CBSA turned around and said that's the job of the Minister for Citizenship and Immigration. The Minister for Citizenship and Immigration said we can't make that determination. That's the problem associated with the CBSA. I think that there's a different category, and that category is the Parliament of Canada, parliamentarians.
That's
you don't
it.
like the Supreme Court decision? Overturn it.
Absolutely.
Invoke the notwithstanding clause.
That's right.
As I said.
Show the courage of your convictions, that's all.
Nothing else.
That's it.
In the meanwhile, respect the Supreme Court's decision.
That's right.
That's the reality.
And the law.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Joe Volpe, on behalf of Corita Canadese, Go Live TV, and Corcan Media Group, with Richard Borax on Law and Reality, inviting you to our next session. Thank you.